These are all really exciting, thought-provoking papers, and this is easily one of the most coherent panels I've ever commented on. I really enjoyed reading them, even more the second time, which is very unusual. But just in the interest of keeping my comments brief, I want to give some time for the audience to ask questions. I'm going to heavily edit my prepared comments, and I'm happy to email them to you. I will email them to you afterwards. So just proceeding in chronological and order of presentation. Rudy begins with one of our favorite opening moves in cultural history, right? This use of dictionary and definitions and words to identify when a concept first appears and how it forms. And I would encourage you to be more transparent about this, be more reflective about how you're using either digital resources and tools to research this term. I'm thinking of Claire Croston, the recent debate about Claire Croston's book and her use of databases to search terms. And I think there's real value to doing that kind of work. I'm really on her side in that. And I think if you're more clear about how you're doing this and expand your search even further to see where the term population first appears and how it evolves, that could be really valuable for situating this, because we are seeing the development of the term along with the development of the concept. I'd also encourage you to be more explicit about how you see the relationship between degeneration and depopulation. In your paper, you present them sometimes as two sides of the same coin, or you present them as having a relationship. But it's more than just a relationship or a connection. I mean, there's something causal going on here, right? For example, does degeneration lead to depopulation? Sometimes it seems like that's the case. Or does repopulation come at the cost of degeneration? If we promote repopulation, are we going to have degeneration? Or the inverse, if we're mixing races, do we have regeneration without degeneration? I also would like to hear more about the colonial case. I know you were kind of eager to put that aside and focus on and not get dragged into where you see there's other scholarship already happening, like William Max Nelson and Sean Quinlan has a chapter on the colonial case. But the colonial case in the 18th century isn't something that's perceived as something really different, right? I mean, colonial medicine or warm climate medicine, what later becomes tropical medicine, is in the 18th century really just the sort of extreme case of metropolitan medicine. There's no clear line between, say, what we think of today as yellow fever and like regular fever in France. It's just a more extreme version. These are understood to be very closely related. There's not a distinction between tropical medicine. And so I think thinking about in terms of what degeneration means in the colonies and thinking about the policies intended to deal with degeneration, which is a constant threat, are understood to be a constant threat, would also help this study quite a bit. And that leads me to my last comment, which is I'm glad that in your talk today you mentioned heredity and heritability. That wasn't something in your original paper, but it's clearly there, right? It's behind all of this. And this is a concept that I think absolutely needs to be considered explicitly and helps to tie together the idea of degeneration and depopulation. Degeneration is something that's perceived often as progressive, right? It's not just these environmental factors, the non-naturals, that can say cause you to degenerate. But then if you degenerate, then your progeny will also be further degenerate and so on. And so we have to think about these non-naturals as accumulating over time, over generations. And again, this is the kind of thing that we see especially in the colonial context, right? There's this fear that this will happen really rapidly under, say, the influence of the torrid zone and the tropical sun and all of this, where Europeans can become Africans in 3 generations. And more importantly, this progressive effect of non-naturals is seen to be not that it's entirely one way, but it's easier to degenerate than it is to regenerate, right? It's easier. We can see how you can have degeneration by Europeans in the tropics in 3-4 generations. It's less clear how we reverse the process and whether that can be achieved quickly and easily. So moving to our next 2 papers, what's really exciting about Parks and Green's papers is that these 2 papers amazingly put the crazy ideas of the 18th century into practice in the 19th and 20th century. And this implementation side of things is, I think, the most exciting part about these two papers. In terms of the theoretical space, this is maybe my old regime bias, but there's not like a lot of like really new ideas, but how they're actually being put in practice on the ground seems really surprising. I was especially intrigued in your part, Sun-Young, in your paper about how these spaces were used by spectators, and the use of them not just say to go to the swimming pool to swim or go to the gymnasium to work out, but people going to watch people swim and watch people work out. And somewhere in there you linked the rise of these spaces to the emergence, the better known emergence of the department store. And so that seems totally counterintuitive to me at first glance. It seemed that somehow exercise and shopping would result in similar public spaces. But when we think about them in terms of spaces where you are there to be seen and also to see, that starts to make more sense. And that connects to how you ended your paper. You ended with this really sort of grim picture of these lumpy, misshapen bodies exercising. But I was wondering, the people that are exercising and know they're on display for spectators, are they embarrassed, or are they proud that they're revealing themselves to be actively engaged in improving their bodies? Like, if we think about these spaces as a place where there are spectators and performers, then maybe it's not a bad thing. If they imagine that they are somehow progressing or regenerating to a more ideal body type. Then lastly, on your paper, the concern about, I love the bit about the Oriental design, right? Because this draws on this long-standing concern of architects that form influences the mind and then the body. So these neoclassical architects that you talk about, they're always really eager to use blunt masculine forms like Tuscan columns in order to keep remind the baser classes of their place. And so you can imagine and you describe the threat of these Oriental spaces, that they will somehow encourage some kind of immoral behavior. So, but I think I wonder if we don't need to consider who's using the pool. So if these are these spaces of embourgeoisement, then maybe these people have such good morals that it's okay for them to be in an Oriental pool, that they're somehow immune to their effects or above it. Or is it maybe that the designers of these spaces know that there's something titillating about them, but it's worth the risk to get people to come to these spaces, to exercise, and to see and be seen. So again, this gets back to the issue of spectators, and I just would like to learn more about that. And then finally, Gina, your paper, taking us on this tour of a model village, this example that you give us of positive eugenics, I found really disturbing, like really disquieting. And I mean, that's good, right? It makes it for a really exciting paper. I, for one, am more familiar with the methods of negative eugenics, right? These are the forced sterilizations, prohibitions on marriage, and I'll be totally honest, I'm familiar with these because I have a colleague at George Mason, Sharon Leon, who is an expert on eugenics, so I'm totally cribbing from her here. So we know these methods of negative eugenics to limit the undesirables in the population, and Rudy actually shows both sides of that, right? There's the Prussian imperative to have more healthful soldiers, and then there's this French idea like let's get rid of all the hunchbacks and one-eyed men. Your portrait of these willing participants reminds us that eugenics was a collaborative project, and I'd like to learn more about. And I think it should be doable to learn more about how the residents of the village perceived these conditions. This embourgeoisement, maybe that was from your paper, not Sun-Young's. This is like gentrification or something. It reminds me of the way that word is thrown around. The way you describe it here, the rules talking about where laundry could be dried, what plants could be grown, no outdoor sheds. This sounds exactly like my homeowners association covenant. So at first you're thinking like, oh, that's not so bad. I mean, it's not great, and then we get to the part about having to have a baby every 2 years. And then it's like, whoa, wait, what? So that's really shocking. And I'd like to learn what happens when your youngest child is 3 years old. You get kicked out, right? I mean, so it makes us question, what is the value? What are they trying to achieve here? I mean, the focus is just on essentially young children, and then from age 2 on, unless there's another one in the pipeline, there's no. What is their benefit or value to the state or whatever? Lastly, on your paper, I'd like to hear more about or see more hear more, see as your work progresses, how you see the category of modern or modernity advancing our understanding of what's going on in this village. So, are these houses nostalgic and backward-looking in their exterior design, but in the interiors seem very modern, right? And as you argue, they're certainly in the service of a very modern social program. And this is where eugenics is really, really tricky, because it can be read, and in your case you do read it as fundamentally conservative and reactionary. But if we think about the eugenics society in Paris, this is something that's seen as very progressive, right? So where does it fall on the political spectrum? Is that even worth investigating? I don't know. And more important, and where I'm on more familiar ground, is when you look at these interior spaces. What we might be tempted from today to read as comfortable and nostalgic, we're from this period extremely modern. And this is drawing, I think, on late 18th and early 19th century understanding of French interior space as the epitome or the vanguard of good interior design. This is something distinctly French, distinctly modern, the idea of arranging interior space in a way that is functional, salubrious, and modern. So I'd like to hear more about that or see how your work progresses. And that is all I will say, and I hope we have time for questions.
My question is for Gina. Gina, thank you very much for a fascinating paper. I'll have to confess that when I read your title, I thought I was going to come hear about Suresnes, and so I was pleasantly surprised that you were focusing on another garden city. It raises an important question, though. Since this is a garden city outside Strasbourg, to what extent are some of the goals to make these people French? Since there is that kind of larger project going on at the time in relationship to Alsace and Lorraine as a whole.
Thank you for your question. I think it's very much an incredibly quirky, specific project because of its relationship to Germany, that special project of making people French had to be part of what was going on. But what I wanted to do, and in a much longer version of this paper, is connect this very specific sort of quirky regional project to themes going on in other garden cities in France during this period, and suggest that even the ones that don't look explicitly nostalgic or explicitly oriented towards eugenics in the way that this very particular one was, have this strain informing decisions about design. So in a future elaboration of this project, I will be speaking more about Suresnes and also Le Corbusier's what's the habitation at Montmartre? What is it?
Unité d'habitation at Marseille.
The Unité d'habitation in Marseille, and say that these modernist schemes that are more clearly based on a different idea of womanhood and are built on ideas of providing communal facilities, all these things that were lacking actually at the Jardin Angamac, but which are traditional features of garden cities, to have day creches and école maternelle and facilities for sport, etc., that they too have a eugenic component kind of built in there because they make issues of sort of hygienic surveillance of homes and the right kind of people procreating sort of also nestled their way into these other programs. But yes, I do think the short answer is that it's very much about a specific issue in Strasbourg to a certain extent.
Why then the style for the exterior architecture and the name? I mean, these are very German sounding, right? Is there a contradiction there?
I mean, I think they just wanted to revive the style of that was traditional in that community, dating back to the early 19th century.
It might be a case of regionalism, sort of knitting into an existing fabric.
Thank you.
Can you hear me? I love these papers. This was fascinating, and I apologize I got lost, so I missed the first one. But one of the things that struck me about the later two papers is that I'm more used to, even as a 19th century and early 20th century historian, I'm more used to thinking about the shortage of housing and the need for these large projects as a post-World War II thing. And it occurred to me as I was listening to the last paper especially, how much this sort of sense of the crisis in architecture and in the availability of space is tied up with this perhaps French, perhaps European, or more broadly, sense of the crisis in the population. And so this is in some ways less a question than a comment, but it does seem like what you're pulling out is a linkage of concerns, architectural and hygienic and space related, that floods through or threads through all of the 19th and the 20th centuries. And I wondered if maybe you could say a little bit more about that, the public space, the availability of housing, and the links to what that says about the state of the French population.
I'm just beginning the piece where I look into what's happening after World War II, and this to just contextualize it as part of a much bigger project, my book manuscript / dissertation, which was looking at how there were attempts to sort of rehabilitate children through architectural design. And this is the final piece of that project, which looks at nursery schools and incubators and creches and asks how did their design evolve in the late 19th and early 20th century. And so what I'll say about housing is just that in all of that research, which was focused on spaces of childhood and the hygienic space for the child to regenerate within, housing just always came up as a theme in the background. In very vivid language, the child is in a dark cave of a home, or wrapped in the folds of microbes, and I mean the language is quite elaborate, describing the nursling left on a pile of rags on the table in the corner. You know how there's all this sort of
pornographic.
Right, I was going to say pornographic, but yeah, there's that sort of prurient interest in the filthy homes of the poor. So I see this all informing. This component runs through all these discussions of how we can regenerate the child, and so this final chapter of my project looks at the housing context. And I hope to then draw connections to the post-war housing plans that were built.
I have a question for Dr. Lemonteo. Have you looked into literature? Because what you were talking about remind me of Thomas More, how we're going to get the fat with the skinny, the tall with the short, so we'll have a homogenized society. And I'm wondering is that really that new, or is it existing already into utopian literature? I study a lot of utopian literature, and it seems to me there's some echoes here from earlier text. Could you comment on that?
Yes. So this will to put different categories of populations, to label different categories of population, and to even create the population that would fit these different categories. I think it's very traditional, but precisely that doesn't appear in Van der Mont's essay. It appears in Le Camus project, which is it's more quirky, but in a way it's more traditional in the way it's conceived. But for Van der Mont, the main thing is to improve the whole human species, and he doesn't categorize different types of population. So he is trying to improve. He sets two different criteria: first, strength, and then beauty that have to be improved. And if you read the whole essay, it appears that sensibility also should be improved because it's influenced by Locke. But it should be improved for the whole population. So I think that's pretty new, precisely because it doesn't derive from Thomas More or Plato the way it derives in other works. Yeah.
Well, we are over time now, so I would encourage you to, if you have questions, to follow up with our panelists either here or by email. Thank you to our panelists for 3 excellent and stimulating papers.